Have you ever stood in front of an open refrigerator and wondered how anyone survived before Freon and compressors? Now imagine hauling 200 pounds of fresh elk meat through the Absorica Range in July, 3 weeks from the nearest trading post, with nothing but a knife and what the landscape provides. The mountain men of the 1820s and 1830s didn't just survive this scenario, they thrived in it, eating fresh meat through blistering summers and bitter winters without a single electrical volt or manufactured ice block. Their refrigerators were creeks, caves, snowbanks, and the ground beneath their moccasins. And they worked so well that modern off-grid homesteaders are now reviving the very same methods. Stay tuned as we explore the brilliant, overlooked physics that turned the entire Rocky Mountain wilderness into a walk-in cooler, and why the deep earth, a running stream, and a simple piece of wet canvas outperformed technology that wouldn't be invented for another century. The first thing to understand is that a mountain man's relationship with meat was fundamentally different from ours. He didn't buy it wrapped in plastic. He harvested a buffalo, an elk, or a mule deer, and he was looking at 500 to 800 pounds of warm flesh that would begin to spoil within hours if he didn't act. In the low-oxygen, high-moisture environment of fresh muscle tissue, bacteria double their population every 20 to 40 minutes at summer temperatures. The threshold for dangerous spoilage, where pathogenic microbes produce toxins that can sicken or kill, is roughly 4 to 6 hours in 80-degree heat. A mountain man breaking down an elk on a sunny slope in June was racing a biological clock that ticked faster than anything in a modern kitchen. He needed to pull the heat out of that meat immediately, and he reached for the same principle that keeps your refrigerator running: move heat from the food to somewhere else. The difference was that his somewhere else was the entire Rocky Mountain ecosystem. Cold water was the quickest tool. High country creeks and beaver ponds, fed by snowmelt that had been liquid for only a few hours, ran at temperatures between 34 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit, even in late summer. That's colder than the inside of a modern refrigerator, which operates at roughly 37 to 40 degrees. A mountain man quartering an elk near a stream would carry the haunches directly into the water, anchoring them with stones in a deep pool where the current would flow over every surface of the meat. The moving water acted as a liquid heat exchanger, drawing thermal energy out of the flesh hundreds of times faster than still air could manage, because water has a thermal conductivity roughly 25 times greater than air. Meat submerged in a cold creek could drop from body temperature to near freezing in under an hour, slamming the brakes on bacterial reproduction. The same haunch hanging from a tree branch in the shade might still be warm at the center hours later. A perfect situation for spoilage organisms to bloom from the inside out. This wasn't just a stopgap measure. Mountain men routinely stored meat underwater for weeks. The temperature alone suppressed spoilage, but the water provided a second benefit. It excluded oxygen, which many of the most aggressive decomposing bacteria require to function. A submerged quarter, especially if wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth or tucked into a submerged clay pot, was effectively sealed in a cold, low-oxygen environment. Fur trade journals are littered with references to beaver pond beef and creek mutton. Jim Bridger's brigade, wintering on the Green River in 1833, kept buffalo meat fresh through early spring by submerging it in a deep pool where ice formed only on the surface, while the water beneath stayed liquid and just above freezing. When the men needed a meal, they'd chop through the ice, haul up a quarter, and cook it. The meat had been sitting underwater for 2 months and was as fresh as the day it was submerged. The stream method solved the immediate cooling problem. But mountain men weren't always camped next to a creek. They moved constantly, trapping tributaries and crossing divides, and they couldn't afford to abandon meat they'd already harvested. What they needed was a portable refrigeration system that didn't require carrying anything extra, and they found it in the physics of evaporation. You've experienced this principle every time you step out of a swimming pool on a breezy day and feel cold, even though the air temperature hasn't changed. Water absorbs an enormous amount of energy when it transitions from liquid to vapor. Roughly 970 BTUs per pound of water evaporated. When you drape a wet cloth over a piece of meat and let the wind blow across it, the evaporating water pulls heat directly out of the flesh, dropping its temperature well below the surrounding air. This is the same mechanism that makes a swamp cooler work, and it can achieve temperature depressions of 10 to 20 degrees in dry mountain air. The mountain man's version was elegant in its simplicity. He'd wrap fresh meat in a canvas sack, soak the sack in a creek, and hang it in the saddle shade on the side of his pack mule. As the brigade moved through the day, the breeze evaporated moisture from the sack, continuously cooling the contents. The method worked best in the arid climate of the Rockies, where low humidity accelerated evaporation. It wasn't a multi-day solution. The sack would dry out and the cooling would stop, but it could keep meat fresh through a long day's ride to the next campsite. And if he re-wet the sack at every stream crossing, the cooling cycle continued indefinitely. Modern experiments replicating this technique have shown that a wet canvas wrap can hold meat at 45 to 55 degrees on an 80-degree day, well inside the safety zone for short-term preservation. But the most important refrigeration technology in the mountain man's arsenal wasn't water or wind. It was the earth itself. The ground beneath the Rockies, even in high summer, remains a constant 45 to 55 degrees once you get 4 to 6 feet below the surface. This is the same thermal mass principle that kept the Halverson sod house warm in a Dakota winter and that made the Arikara earth lodges livable year-round. The soil is an enormous thermal battery. Summer heat penetrates only the top few feet. Below that, the Earth holds the average annual temperature of the region, which in the high Rockies is downright chilly. A hole dug into the north slope of a hill, shaded from direct sun, could be 10 degrees colder than the valley floor. The mountain men knew this intuitively. They didn't need to understand the thermodynamics. They just knew that if you dug a deep enough cache and lined it with stones, the meat you put inside would stay cold for weeks. The fur trade cache was a work of art disguised as a hole in the ground. The technique had been taught to early trappers by Native American hunters and had been refined into a standardized procedure. A man would select a well-drained site, often under an overhanging rock or in the dense shade of a pine grove. He'd excavate a shaft 4 to 6 feet deep, flaring outward at the bottom to create a bell-shaped chamber. The walls were lined with flat stones or dry grass to insulate and to keep the surrounding soil from direct contact with the food. Fresh meat, wrapped in oiled leather or parfleche, was lowered into the chamber where the ambient temperature hovered in the mid-40s. The shaft was then backfilled with earth, packed tight and often disguised with leaves and brush to hide it from scavenging grizzlies and rival trapping parties. A properly constructed cache could hold meat fresh for 2 to 3 weeks in summer and for months in winter. The exclusion of light, the lack of oxygen once the pit was sealed, and the steady, cool temperature created an environment where spoilage organisms struggled to function. Some caches went further. A trapper named Osborne Russell, whose Journal of a Trapper is one of the finest first-hand accounts of the mountain man era, described a cache on the Yellowstone River in 1835 where buffalo meat was packed in alternating layers with wild mint and sage. When the cache was opened 3 weeks later, Russell wrote, "The meat was not only fresh, but it absorbed a faint herbal flavor that his companions declared superior to anything they'd eaten at the St. Louis markets." The herbs likely contributed more than flavor. Many aromatic plants contain antimicrobial compounds that inhibit bacterial growth, a principle now confirmed by food science laboratories studying the preservative effects of essential oils from sage, thyme, and mint. Coming out of the mountains for the summer rendezvous, a trapper might have a pack string of valuable furs, but he didn't want to haul fresh meat that far. The caches remained hidden in the backcountry. When a brigade returned to a cached site months later, the men expected to find the meat edible. They usually did. The caches were the mountain man's deep freezer, buried and waiting, entirely passive, and they worked because the physics of the Earth's thermal mass doesn't require electricity or maintenance. If the hole was deep enough, the meat stayed cold. It was that simple. When cold, wet, and earth-based cooling weren't enough, the mountain men turned to a suite of preservation techniques that fundamentally altered the food's biochemistry and made it virtually immortal. Smoking and drying were the most universal. The logic was straightforward. Bacteria need water to reproduce. Remove the water and the clock stops. Fresh meat is roughly 70% water by weight. When you slice it thin and hang it in the sun and wind of the high plains, the dry air wicks moisture out of the tissue. When you add the smoke of a low, smoldering fire, usually green cottonwood, willow, or alder, you deposit a thin layer of antimicrobial compounds, including phenols, formaldehyde, and acetic acid on the surface of the meat. The combination of dehydration and chemical treatment creates jerky, a product with a moisture content below 10% that can sit at room temperature for months without molding. The mountain men ate jerky constantly. It was their version of a protein bar. A handful of strips, a gulp of creek water, and they could cover 30 miles in a day. But they also made something far more sophisticated, a food so nutritionally complete and shelf-stable that it became the primary winter ration of the entire fur trade economy: pemmican. The word itself is Cree, from pemmican, meaning manufactured grease. The concept had been perfected by the indigenous peoples of the northern plains, who understood that dried meat alone, while durable, lacked the caloric density needed for extreme cold. They needed fat, the most energy-dense macronutrient, and they needed it preserved in a form that would not go rancid. Traditional pemmican was made by pounding dried buffalo or elk meat into a fibrous powder, then mixing it with rendered fat in roughly equal proportions by weight. The fat was heated into liquid, poured over the meat powder, and stirred into a thick paste that was then packed into rawhide bags and sewn shut. Sometimes dried berries were added: chalk cherries, service berries, buffalo berries, which contributed a small amount of vitamin C that helped prevent scurvy during winter months when fresh plants were unavailable. The finished pemmican was a solid, dense loaf that could be cut with a knife. A pound of pemmican contained roughly 3,000 to 3,500 calories, and a man could carry a week's worth of rations in a single leather pouch. What made pemmican extraordinary wasn't just its calorie count, it was its stability. Properly prepared pemmican, with the fat rendered until all water was driven off and the meat dried to brittle hardness, contained almost no moisture and was sealed inside the fat matrix from atmospheric oxygen. In this state, it could last for years without refrigeration. Fur trade records document pemmican that was consumed 5, 7, even 10 years after it was made, with no discernible loss of flavor or nutritional value. The Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company relied on pemmican as their standard travel ration, purchasing it by the ton from Métis and Plains Cree producers and storing it in warehouses at Fort Garry and York Factory for years at a stretch. It was the original MRE, and it worked on the same principle as Elias Cormac's everlasting hardtack. Remove the water, exclude the air, and time becomes irrelevant. The mountain men learned pemmican making from Native American wives and trading partners, and they adapted it to their own wandering life. A trapper heading into the Wind River Range in October might carry 60 pounds of pemmican and nothing else. That 60 pounds would feed him for 2 months. He didn't need to hunt, he didn't need to stop and build a fire. He could eat it cold, slice it into boiling water for an instant soup, or fry it in its own fat. In a landscape where winter temperatures routinely fell to 30 below and fresh game was unpredictable, pemmican wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between walking out in the spring and freezing into a snowbank with an empty belly. The final piece of the mountain man's refrigeration system was the most obvious and the most seasonal: winter itself. In the deep, cold months, the entire world became a freezer. Meat hung from a tree branch would freeze solid within hours and remain frozen until the spring thaw. Frozen meat, as modern deer hunters know, can last for months without appreciable loss of quality, provided it's protected from freeze-thaw cycles and scavengers. The mountain men used snow as insulation, piling it over caches of frozen quarters to keep the temperature stable through warm spells. A snow-packed meat pile, covered with pine boughs to block the sun, could stay frozen long after the surrounding snow had melted, preserving the harvest from a fall buffalo hunt until early summer. The Hudson's Bay Company constructed ice houses at its major posts using the same principle: pits dug deep into the ground, filled with blocks of river ice cut in February, and insulated with sawdust and straw. Properly constructed, those ice houses kept ice solid through August, providing summer refrigeration for the post's fresh meat and dairy. The mountain man in the backcountry didn't have an ice house, but he knew about insulating with earth. He'd dig a cold cellar into a north-facing bank, pack it with snow and ice in March, cover it with a thick layer of spruce boughs and dirt, and use it as a summer cooler. The ice wouldn't last all summer, but it would last well into June, extending the season for fresh meat by months. What unified all of these methods was not a gadget or a chemical formula. It was a mindset that saw the landscape as a working machine. The mountain man knew the temperature of every creek he crossed. He could read a slope and predict how deep he'd need to dig to hit cool earth. He understood that a north-facing hollow held snow weeks longer than a south-facing ridge, that the shade of a ponderosa pine dropped the ground temperature by 15 degrees, that a breeze through a wet cloth could chill meat almost as fast as a stream. All of this was information gathered through observation and passed from mentor to greenhorn across campfires. It required no electricity, no moving parts, no supply chain. The mountain man's refrigerator was the mountain itself. This is the part of the story that tends to hit modern readers in the gut, because we've been taught to believe that food safety requires a compressor and a thermostat. The numbers say otherwise. A 2017 study in the Journal of Food Science and Technology examined traditional water submersion storage and found that meat held at 40 degrees Fahrenheit in flowing water showed bacterial counts 1/10 those of meat held at the same temperature in still air, due to the continuous scrubbing effect of the water removing surface bacteria. A 2020 paper in Foods tested pemmican made according to historical recipes and found no detectable spoilage organisms after 9 months of room temperature storage. The methods work. They worked 200 years ago, they worked 1,000 years ago, and they'd work tomorrow if you found yourself in a situation where the grid was gone and the elk was on the ground. The mountain man's answer to the refrigeration question was ultimately the same as Amos Selkirk's answer to the heating question. Pay attention to the material properties of the world around you. Cold water pulls heat out of flesh 25 times faster than cold air. Earth at 6 feet deep holds a steady 50 degrees regardless of the weather above it. A pound of evaporating water carries away almost 1,000 BTUs. A matrix of dry meat and rendered fat, sealed from air, is functionally immortal. These are not secrets. They are facts of physics that every mountain man carried in his head because his life depended on them. The tragedy is that most of us have forgotten them, and we now pay monthly bills to machines that do what a hole in the ground and a running stream used to do for free. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's the oldest food preservation method you or your family has ever used? Hit that subscribe button for one wilderness survival technique every week. And hit the like button if this story changed how you think about the cold ground under your feet. Because sometimes the best technology isn't in the appliance aisle. It's in the landscape, waiting for someone who knows how to use it.